Tears streamed down the mail-order bride's face as she huddled in the corner of the dusty barn, her dreams of a new life shattered like the morning frost. The rancher's little daughter appeared in the doorway, her innocent eyes wide with wonder as she whispered the words that would change everything. "Are you my mama?" Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The stagecoach rattled to a halt, sending one final jolt through Clara Whitfield's aching body. For 6 grueling days, she had endured the journey from Boston to the Wyoming Territory, each mile taking her further from everything familiar. As the dust settled around the vehicle, Clara peered through the small window at what was to be her new home, the Rourke Ranch. "End of the line, ma'am," the driver called, his voice as rough as the terrain surrounding them. Clara gathered her 2 modest valises, all that remained of her former life, and stepped carefully onto Wyoming soil. The vast emptiness struck her immediately. Endless brown hills rolling toward distant mountains, the landscape so different from Boston's crowded streets and brick buildings. A biting wind whipped her skirts and threatened to steal her bonnet, carrying the scent of sage and cattle. 3 men stood waiting. The tallest stepped forward, and Clara knew instantly this was Caleb Rourke, the man whose advertisement she had answered, whose letters had been brief but promising. His face, weathered by sun and wind, revealed little emotion as he offered a measured nod of acknowledgement. "Miss Whitfield," he said simply, his voice deep and reserved. "Mr. Rourke," Clara replied, fighting to keep her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "Thank you for meeting me." Caleb's sagebrush green eyes studied her with an intensity that made Clara straighten her spine despite the pain of the journey. He was handsome in a rugged way, but nothing in his expression suggested the welcome she had secretly hoped for. "These are my hands," he said, gesturing to the 2 men behind him. "Tom and Hank." The men touched their hats respectfully, but their curious glances made Clara feel like a specimen under examination. She was acutely aware of her city clothes, now wrinkled and dust-covered, marking her as an outsider. "The house is just over that rise," Caleb explained, taking her bags without asking. "We'll get you settled before supper." As they walked toward a modest ranch house in the distance, Clara felt the weight of the silence between them. Each step revealed more of her new surroundings: a weathered barn, a corral with horses, outbuildings that served purposes she could only guess at. Everything looked worn but functional, speaking of hard work rather than comfort. 2 ranch dogs circled them, sniffing at Clara's hem with suspicion. In the distance, cattle dotted the hillsides like scattered pebbles. "It's not Boston," Caleb said suddenly, as if reading her thoughts. "No," Clara agreed, summoning a smile despite her apprehension, "but it has its own beauty." His expression softened almost imperceptibly, but Clara caught it, the first tiny crack in his reserve. As they approached the house, she squared her shoulders. The parlors of Boston were indeed far behind her, but ahead lay the life she had chosen, however uncertain it might be. Clara Whitfield stood awkwardly in the doorway of the modest ranch house, her trunk still clutched in gloved hands that betrayed her city upbringing. 4 pairs of eyes studied her with varying degrees of curiosity and reservation. The ranch hands, 2 weather-beaten men whose names she'd already forgotten in her nervousness, nodded politely before excusing themselves to the bunkhouse. "This is where we eat," Caleb said flatly, gesturing to a rough-hewn table that had seen better days. His voice carried no warmth, just the practical tone of someone explaining the location of furniture. "Kitchen's through there. Your room's upstairs, end of the hall." Little Lottie hovered behind her father's leg, peeking out with wide, searching eyes that seemed to catalog Clara's every movement. The child's fingers twisted anxiously in the fabric of her worn dress, her other hand clutching a threadbare rag doll. "Thank you," Clara managed, setting down her trunk with deliberate care. The floorboards creaked beneath her boots, sturdy but still too new, too clean compared to everyone else's. "It's a lovely home." Caleb's expression suggested he recognized the polite lie, but appreciated the effort. "It serves its purpose." That first evening meal was an exercise in discomfort. Clara's attempts at conversation fell flat against Caleb's monosyllabic responses. Her Boston table manners, the careful way she held her fork, her straight posture, felt ridiculously formal amid the functional efficiency of ranch dining. The stew remained largely untouched on her plate, her appetite smothered by anxiety. "Don't you like it?" Lottie finally asked, breaking her own silence. "I'm just tired from the journey," Clara replied with a gentle smile. The girl nodded solemnly as if she understood everything that remained unsaid. Night brought no relief. In her sparse upstairs room, Clara lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Wyoming territory, the distant howl of coyotes, the creak of the house settling, the occasional whinny from the barn. Back in Boston, she'd never known such profound silence between sounds. The following days established a pattern. Caleb would rise before dawn, exchange minimal words over breakfast, then disappear into the vastness of the ranch until sundown. The rancher moved through his own home like a ghost, careful not to disturb the fragile peace or risk genuine connection. Lottie watched Clara constantly, her hopeful gaze following the newcomer as she attempted to learn the rhythms of ranch life. Sometimes the child would almost speak, then retreat into silence, as if testing whether this stranger might disappear if approached too directly. At night, Clara could hear laughter in the walls, echoes of happier times when this house had been a true home. Now it felt like a collection of strangers orbiting each other, connected by circumstance but separated by unspoken grief and caution. Each meal, each passing day, each awkward exchange only emphasized what was missing: trust, history, belonging. Clara wondered if she would ever find her place in this family of strangers. The moon cast long shadows across the barn floor as Clara Whitfield slipped inside, careful not to let the heavy door creak. 3 nights at the Rourke Ranch, and sleep continued to elude her. The familiar scent of hay and horses wrapped around her like an old friend, perhaps the only familiar comfort in this vast, alien territory. Clara sank into a pile of straw, her shoulders finally releasing the tension she'd maintained all day. Here, hidden from watchful eyes, she could finally breathe. The barn's wooden beams creaked gently overhead, a symphony accompanied by the soft nickering of horses in their stalls. "What have I done?" she whispered, her Boston accent still clinging to her words. The tears came then, silent at first, then building into muffled sobs that she buried in her hands. She had left everything: her small apartment above the milliner's shop, her few friends, the graves of her parents, all for this desolate place with its endless horizon and a husband who barely looked at her. A distant howl pierced the night, sending a shiver down her spine. Wolves. So different from the city sounds she knew. Clara pulled her shawl tighter, remembering how Caleb had warned her never to wander the property after dark. The rancher's warnings had been delivered with the same detached tone he used for everything, as if she were just another responsibility to manage, not a wife. Her fingers absently stroked the rough wood of the stall beside her. The chestnut mare inside stretched her neck, curious about the nighttime visitor. "At least you're friendly," Clara murmured, reaching up to stroke the horse's velvet nose. "I don't even know how to ride properly." What kind of rancher's wife doesn't know horses? The floorboards creaked behind her, and Clara hastily wiped her tears. Turning, she expected to find Caleb's tall frame, perhaps angry at finding her wandering at night. Instead, a small figure stood in the shadows, clutching something to her chest. "Lottie," Clara breathed, embarrassed to be caught crying. "You should be asleep, sweetheart." The child took a tentative step forward, her nightgown ghostly white in the moonlight streaming through the barn's high windows. In her arms, she clutched her rag doll, its button eyes reflecting twin pinpricks of light. Lottie's face, so much like her father's, held none of his guardedness, only open curiosity and something else. "Hope?" "I heard you leave," the girl said, simply, her voice small but clear in the night stillness. She took another step closer, studying Clara with those searching eyes that seemed too knowing for one so young. "Do you not like it here?" Clara's heart twisted. How could she explain adult sorrows to a child who had already lost so much? Instead, she patted the hay beside her, offering a place in her solitude. The question hung in the air, simple yet devastating in its innocence. "Are you my mama?" Lottie Rourke's small voice trembled with hope as she clutched her rag doll tightly against her chest. Her wide eyes, reflecting the dim lantern light, searched Clara's face for an answer that could change everything. Clara Whitfield felt her breath catch. The barn's familiar sense of hay and horses faded as the world narrowed to this child standing before her, this little girl who had lost so much and still dared to hope. She had come to Wyoming to escape her own pain, not to inherit someone else's. Yet here was Lottie, offering her heart with the directness only children possess. Clara began, her voice breaking, She reached out with trembling fingers to brush a strand of hair from the child's forehead. "I wasn't your first mama, sweetheart, but I would very much like to try to be a good mama to you now, if you'll let me." Lottie's face brightened like sunrise breaking over the prairie. Without hesitation, she stepped forward and wrapped her small arms around Clara's waist, burying her face in the folds of her dress. The rag doll dangled forgotten from one hand. "I wrote letters asking for you," the child whispered against the fabric. "I told them my papa needed someone to smile at him again, and I needed someone to braid my hair and kiss me goodnight." Clara's eyes filled with tears as she held Lottie close. The weight of the child's expectations should have terrified her, but instead she felt something crack open inside her chest, something that had been sealed tight since she'd left Boston behind. "I'm not very good at braiding yet," she admitted softly, "but I promise I'll learn." Lottie pulled back just enough to look up at Clara. "That's all right. You can practice on me." From the shadows near the barn door, Caleb Rourke watched the exchange, his throat tight with emotions he'd sworn never to feel again. He had brought this woman here for practical reasons. The ranch needed a woman's touch, and Lottie needed mothering he couldn't provide. He'd told himself it was a business arrangement, nothing more. Yet witnessing this moment, seeing his daughter's hand slip trustingly into Clara's, something shifted inside him. The wall he'd built around his heart developed its first hairline crack. The rancher stepped back silently, unwilling to intrude on their fragile new bond, but as he turned to leave, the floorboard beneath his boot creaked traitorously. 2 pairs of eyes turned toward him, one questioning, one uncertain, and for the first time since Clara's arrival, Caleb found himself unable to maintain his carefully constructed distance. The last patches of snow melted into muddy puddles as spring breathed new life into the Wyoming territory. Clara Whitfield rose before dawn each day, determined to prove her worth on the Rourke Ranch. Her soft Boston hands, once accustomed to embroidery and piano keys, now blistered and cracked from ranch work. "You're holding that branding iron all wrong," one of the ranch hands called out as Clara struggled to maintain her grip. The iron slipped, missing the calf entirely and nearly singeing her skirt. The men's laughter rippled across the corral, but there was less mockery in it than there had been weeks ago. In the cookhouse, she battled with the temperamental wood stove. The first loaves emerged blackened on the bottom, filling the small building with acrid smoke. Clara sighed, cutting away the burnt portions before serving what remained. The cowboys ate without complaint, a small kindness she hadn't expected. "At least the coffee's improving," muttered one weathered hand, tipping his hat to her before heading back to work. Caleb observed her efforts from a distance, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. When she struggled to saddle a horse, her arms trembling with the weight, he stepped forward as if to help, then retreated, his pride and uncertainty creating an invisible barrier between them. "You need to tighten that cinch more," he finally offered, the first advice he'd given in days. "Horse'll throw the saddle otherwise." Clara nodded, grateful for the instruction. "Thank you," she said simply, meeting his gaze. For a moment something softened in his sagebrush eyes before he turned away. Each small victory became precious to her. The morning she successfully built a fire in the rain. The day she managed to collect eggs without being pecked bloody. The evening Lottie fell asleep against her shoulder as she read aloud from a tattered book of fairy tales. Most meaningful was the afternoon she calmed a spooked colt, speaking in the same gentle tones she once used with nervous students at Boston's music recitals. The ranch hands had watched in surprise as the frightened animal settled under her touch. "Where'd you learn that trick?" asked one. "Some creatures just need patience," she replied, stroking the colt's velvet muzzle. "And to know they're not alone." Later she caught Caleb watching her from the corral fence, something like respect flickering across his features before he turned back to his work. That night, Clara wrote in her journal by candlelight, "Perhaps this land isn't so different from Boston after all. Both require perseverance. Both test what you're made of, and perhaps in time, both can become home." The first trip into town left Clara Whitfield with no illusions about her welcome. As she guided the wagon down the dusty main street with little Lottie beside her, whispers followed like autumn leaves in their wake. Women paused their shopping to stare openly, while men tipped their hats with smiles that never reached their eyes. "That's her, Caleb Rourke's mail-order bride," one woman murmured, loud enough for Clara to hear. "Barely off the stagecoach before she had a ring on her finger." Clara tightened her grip on the reins, feeling the rough leather bite into her palms. The general store proved no sanctuary. The shopkeeper's wife measured out flour with glacial slowness, her gaze calculating as she asked pointed questions about Boston and Clara's hasty marriage. "Must be quite the adjustment," the woman remarked, "going from city comforts to ranch life. Some might wonder what you're really after." "Just sugar and coffee today, thank you," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the heat rising in her cheeks. Lottie's small hand slipped into hers. "Miss Clara makes the best biscuits now," the child announced proudly, her innocent defense cutting through the tension. It was during their third visit to town that Clara found an unexpected ally. She had ducked into the saloon to escape a particularly vicious group of gossiping women, only to find herself face-to-face with Miss Abigail, the establishment's owner. With her henna'd hair and shrewd eyes, the saloon-keeper hardly seemed a likely friend. "Sit down before you fall down," Miss Abigail said, sliding a cup of tea across the bar. "Those vultures been pecking at you again?" Clara sank onto a stool, grateful for the momentary respite. "They seem determined to believe the worst." "Been running this place 15 years, the older woman said, leaning forward. "Came here a widow with nothing but determination. They called me worse than opportunist." She tapped a finger against the wooden counter. "This town's like a wild horse. It'll test you, throw you, and trample you if it can. But stand your ground long enough, and eventually it'll let you ride." When Clara left the saloon, she walked differently, head high, shoulders back, meeting the stairs with a calm she didn't entirely feel. At the mercantile, she smiled at the whispering women and asked about their families by name, watching confusion replace contempt in their eyes. "You look like a real lady today," Lottie observed as they loaded their supplies into the wagon. Clara smoothed the child's hair. "I'm learning that being a lady isn't about where you come from," she said, "but how you face what's in front of you." On the ride home, with the town's judgmental gaze fading behind them, Clara found herself drawing strength from the little girl's unwavering trust and her own growing resilience. The summer sun beat down mercilessly as the Rourke Ranch bustled with preparations for the annual cattle drive. Clara Whitfield wiped sweat from her brow, watching as cowboys mounted their horses and cattle bellowed in protest. 3 months in Wyoming territory had hardened her hands, but not her resolve. "You'll stay behind," Caleb announced, his voice leaving no room for argument. He adjusted his hat, squinting against the harsh light. "The trail's no place for a city woman," Clara finished, lifting her chin. "I've learned more than you think." The rancher's weathered face betrayed nothing, but his eyes lingered on her longer than necessary. "Suit yourself," he finally muttered, turning to mount his horse. Lottie appeared at Clara's side, small fingers clutching the fabric of her skirt. "I'm coming with you and Papa," she declared, her eyes wide with determination. When Clara hesitated, the child's grip tightened. "Please, I don't want to stay with Mrs. Peterson again." Clara knelt down, brushing dust from the girl's cheek. "It'll be hard, sweetheart. Long days, cold nights. I don't care," Lottie whispered. "I want to stay with you." Those simple words melted something in Clara's chest. She glanced up to find Caleb watching them, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he gave a curt nod. The first day on the trail proved brutal. Dust clogged Clara's throat and stung her eyes as the massive herd moved across the prairie. She rode alongside the chuck wagon, learning to cook over open flames while the earth moved beneath them. By nightfall, every muscle in her body screamed in protest. Around the campfire, cowboys shared stories and passed a bottle. Clara sat slightly apart, Lottie's head heavy against her shoulder as the child drifted to sleep. Across the flames, Caleb's face was illuminated in golden light, his features softened by exhaustion. "She's taken to you," one of the older hands commented, nodding toward the sleeping child. Clara smiled faintly. "And I to her. Never seen the boss let anyone get close since—" The cowboy trailed off, glancing toward Caleb. On the third night, a summer storm rolled across the plains. Rain pelted the canvas as Clara huddled with Lottie in the wagon, listening to the men struggle to keep the cattle from scattering. When Caleb finally stumbled in, soaked to the bone, Clara wordlessly offered him a blanket. Their fingers brushed, and for once he didn't pull away. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for being good to her." Clara looked at the sleeping child between them. "She makes it easy." In the soft glow of the lantern, something shifted between them, tentative and fragile as a prairie wildflower. Out here, away from the ranch and the town's judgmental eyes, they were simply 3 people finding their way through the wilderness, together. Word of the railroad's expansion spread like wildfire across the Wyoming territory. 3 men in tailored suits arrived at the Rourke Ranch one dusty afternoon, their polished boots and clean fingernails marking them as outsiders. Clara Whitfield watched from the porch as Caleb's shoulders tensed at their approach. "Mr. Rourke," the tallest one called out, "Western Pacific Railroad's offering fair prices for this land. Better sell now before your neighbors drive the price down." Caleb's jaw tightened. "This ranch isn't for sale at any price." The meeting moved to the main house, where maps were spread across the worn wooden table. Clara served coffee, listening intently as the railroad men outlined their plans. Their words were slick with promises, but their offers were insultingly low. "You'll be compensated for improvements to the property," one said, sliding papers toward Caleb. "Just sign here." Clara glanced at the document, recognizing the deceptive language from contracts she'd seen in Boston. Without thinking, she spoke up. "This clause surrenders water rights to all streams on the property," she said, pointing to the fine print. "And this paragraph grants immediate access before payment is complete." The room fell silent. The ranch hands exchanged surprised glances while the railroad men shifted uncomfortably. Caleb stared at Clara, his expression unreadable. "My wife knows her letters," he finally said, a hint of pride in his voice. It was the first time he'd called her wife, without hesitation. Over the next week, more fortune-seekers arrived, circling the Rourke property like vultures. At each meeting, Clara sat beside Caleb, her Boston education proving unexpectedly valuable. She spotted hidden clauses, questioned vague terms, and suggested counteroffers that protected their interests. "Where'd you learn all this?" Caleb asked one evening as they walked back from the barn. "My father was a clerk for a shipping company," she replied. "He taught me to read contracts carefully." The rancher nodded, looking out across the land that had been in his family for generations. "I always figured I could protect this place with just hard work and determination," he admitted. "Never thought I'd need fancy words and legal knowledge." Clara smiled gently. Some battles need different weapons. That night, as Lottie slept soundly in her room, Caleb asked Clara to help draft a letter to the railroad company. As they worked side by side, their shoulders occasionally touching, something shifted between them. The rancher was beginning to see that the woman from Boston brought more than just an extra pair of hands to his home. She brought skills he never knew he needed, and strength he hadn't expected. For the first time, Caleb realized he couldn't, and perhaps didn't need to, face these challenges alone. The late August sun painted the Wyoming territory in golden hues as Clara Whitfield made her way back from town, basket of supplies hanging from her arm. She'd spent the afternoon with Sarah and Elizabeth, 2 ranchers' wives who had finally warmed to her presence after months of cautious distance. Their conversation over tea had been pleasant enough, filled with talk of preserves in the coming harvest, yet Clara couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider still finding her footing. "Mrs. Rourke," Lottie called, racing across the yard the moment the wagon came into view. The child had taken to waiting by the fence whenever Clara ventured to town, counting minutes until her return. Clara lifted the girl into her arms, breathing in the scent of sunshine and dirt that clung to her small frame. "Did you help your father with the chickens like you promised?" Lottie nodded enthusiastically, her fingers playing with the lace collar of Clara's dress. "Pa said I did real good. Are you staying forever now?" The innocent question tightened something in Clara's chest. She set the child down gently, smoothing her unruly curls. "Let's get these supplies inside." Across the yard, Caleb straightened from mending a fence, acknowledging her return with a brief nod before returning to his work. 3 months of marriage. And still he maintained that careful distance, civil, even kind at times, but guarded in ways that left Clara wondering if she'd ever truly be his wife, in more than name. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the plains, Lottie followed Clara through every chore, chattering about a nest of kittens she'd discovered in the woodshed. The child's devotion was both blessing and burden, a reminder of the promise made that night in the barn, a promise Clara feared she might not be able to fulfill completely without Caleb's heart softening. After Lottie was tucked in, Clara slipped out to the barn, seeking solitude in the familiar sanctuary. The horses nickered softly as she settled onto a bale of hay, finally allowing the tears she'd held back all day to fall freely. "What am I doing here?" she whispered to the rafters. "Playing at being a mother, playing at being a wife." She thought of the women in town, their sideways glances when they thought she wasn't looking, their hushed conversations that stopped when she approached. Despite Sarah and Elizabeth's kindness, Clara knew what the others said, that she was an opportunist, a city woman who couldn't possibly understand their ways. The barn door creaked, and Clara hastily wiped her eyes, but it was only the wind. She wrapped her arms around herself, offering up silent prayers, for patience, for belonging, for Caleb to see her as more than a convenient mother for his daughter. Outside, coyotes called to one another across the darkening prairie, their mournful voices echoing Clara's own loneliness. Yet as she rose to return to the house, she squared her shoulders. Tomorrow would be another day to try again. Clara was changing the bedsheets in Lottie's small room when she noticed the corner of a paper peeking out from beneath the pillow. Thinking it might be a drawing the child had made, she gently tugged at it, only to find not one paper but several. Letters, folded and refolded so many times the creases had nearly worn through. Her eyes widened as she read the first one, written in a child's unsteady hand. "Dear lady who finds mamas, please send one for me. My papa is sad and I need someone to braid my hair." The second was even more heart-wrenching. The mama should know. "Stories and not mind if I ask questions. Papa says questions are good, but he gets tired." Clara sank onto the edge of the bed, letters trembling in her hands. Each one revealed another facet of Lottie's longing, for bedtime stories, for someone to teach her to sew, for a woman who wouldn't mind tears. The final letter simply read, "Please hurry." Papa forgets to smile. A wave of guilt washed over Clara. She hadn't been chosen by Caleb at all. It was Lottie who had orchestrated this union, this family they were trying to build. The matchmaking agency must have forwarded the child's letters to prospective brides, including her. Clara remembered how those earnest pleas had touched her heart, even before she'd met the little girl. She carefully returned the letters to their hiding place, her chest tight with emotion. How desperate this child must have been to take such matters into her own small hands. Every shy smile, every hopeful glance from Lottie now carried new meaning. This wasn't just a child adapting to a stranger in her home. This was a carefully planned rescue mission. Later that evening, Clara watched Lottie chattering excitedly about a frog she'd found by the creek. The child's eyes constantly darted to Clara for approval, for confirmation that she was listening. Each interaction was layered with unspoken need. From across the room, Caleb observed them both, his weathered face unreadable. But when Lottie ran to fetch her rag doll to show Clara, something shifted in his expression. For a brief moment his guard dropped, revealing a father overwhelmed by his daughter's yearning for motherly love, a need he couldn't fulfill despite his best efforts. His eyes met Clara's, and in that fleeting connection, she understood that he knew about the letters too. His pride had kept him from acknowledging how desperately his daughter needed what Clara could provide, and perhaps what he needed as well. As Lottie returned, Clara opened her arms, embracing both the child and the responsibility she had unknowingly accepted through those hidden letters. The first warning came as a distant smudge on the horizon, a dark stain against the clear blue Wyoming sky. Clara Whitfield was hanging laundry when she noticed it, the sheets snapping in the wind that suddenly felt ominous rather than refreshing. "Fire!" one of the ranch hands shouted, his voice carrying across the yard. Within moments, the Rourke ranch erupted into frantic activity. Men rushed for horses while others grabbed buckets and shovels. The prairie fire was moving fast, driven by the same wind that had seemed so innocent minutes before. Clara's heart seized when she realized Lottie wasn't in the house. The little girl had mentioned checking on a new calf in the far pasture. Without hesitation, she hitched up her skirts and ran toward the barn, ignoring Caleb's shouts behind her. "Get back to the house," he called, already mounting his horse. The rancher's face was etched with worry, his eyes reflecting the growing orange glow on the horizon. "Lottie's out there!" Clara yelled back, grabbing a horse's reins from a startled ranch hand. Before anyone could stop her, she was galloping toward the pasture, her Boston riding lessons suddenly proving useful in ways she'd never imagined. The smoke thickened as she rode, stinging her eyes and scratching her throat. Through watering eyes, she spotted a small figure huddled beside a fence post, clutching something to her chest. Relief flooded through Clara as she reached Lottie, who was protecting the tiny calf with her own body. "We need to go now," she urged, lifting the child onto the horse. The girl's face was streaked with soot, her eyes wide with terror. "But the baby cow!" Lottie protested. "The mother will find it," Clara promised, knowing it might be a lie but seeing no alternative as the wall of flame advanced. They rode hard back toward the ranch, the fire chasing them like a hungry predator. When they arrived, chaos reigned. Clara took charge with unexpected authority, directing men to wet down the barn roof while others dug fire breaks. She organized a bucket line from the well, her voice clear and commanding above the roar of the approaching flames. "Get those horses to the creek bed," she ordered, placing Lottie safely in the root cellar with supplies. "And bring more wet blankets for the roof." For hours they fought the relentless advance of the fire. When it finally passed, leaving charred earth in its wake, the ranch building stood, scorched but intact. The herd had been saved, though some fencing was destroyed. That evening, as they counted their blessings around the dinner table, Caleb's gaze met Clara's across the room. The respect in his eyes was unmistakable. "You saved my daughter," he said simply, "and half the ranch besides." The ranch hands nodded in agreement, their earlier skepticism replaced by something new: acceptance. Clara had proven herself not through proper manners or refined speech, but through courage when it mattered most. The cloud of dust on the horizon announced a rider long before anyone could make out his features. Clara Whitfield stood on the porch, shielding her eyes against the midday sun, while Caleb tensed beside her. When the figure drew close enough, the rancher's face hardened like Wyoming granite. "Elias," he muttered, the single word carrying years of unspoken history. Elias Rourke dismounted with an easy grace that matched his brother's, though where Caleb was weathered by sun and work, Elias bore the polished look of city living. His clothes were finer, his hands less calloused. He greeted Clara with a charm that seemed both natural and calculated. "So you're the mail-order bride who's tamed my brother's wild household," he said, tipping his hat. "Pleasure to make your acquaintance, ma'am." That evening, after Lottie had been tucked into bed, the true purpose of his visit emerged over whiskey at the kitchen table. The railroad company had made Elias an offer. They wanted the Rourke land, and they were willing to pay handsomely for it. "It's the future, Caleb," Elias insisted, spreading maps across the worn table. "This ranch is dying. The railroad means prosperity." Caleb's fist came down hard. "This land isn't for sale. Not to the railroad. Not to anyone." "Still stubborn as a mule," his brother scoffed. "Just like Pa." "Don't you dare mention him," Caleb growled, rising so suddenly his chair toppled backward. "You lost that right when you abandoned us after Ma died." Clara watched the brothers circle each other like wolves, years of resentment bubbling to the surface. Elias had left when the ranch faced its darkest days, seeking fortune elsewhere, while Caleb shouldered their father's debts and broken promises alone. "I didn't abandon anyone," Elias shot back. "I refused to be buried alive in this God-forsaken place." For 3 days, the tension hung over the ranch like storm clouds. Lottie, sensing the discord, clung to Clara more fiercely than ever. The child had never known her uncle before, and his sudden appearance confused her quiet world. Clara found herself mediating impossible conversations. She understood Caleb's fierce attachment to the land that had shaped him, but she also recognized in Elias's restlessness something of her own former life, the yearning for more than what fate had assigned. "He left us with nothing," Caleb confessed to her one night, his voice uncharacteristically vulnerable. "Pa died broken, and Elias was nowhere to be found." On the 4th morning, Clara discovered Elias by the corral at dawn, watching the horses with unexpected gentleness. "I didn't come just for the railroad," he admitted quietly. "I came to make peace. But some wounds run too deep, I suppose." When he rode away that afternoon, the dust cloud following him seemed smaller somehow, as if carrying away possibilities that would never be realized. The ranch settled back into its rhythms, but Clara knew that some doors, once opened, could never be fully closed again. Clara Whitfield's hands trembled as she unfolded the letter that had arrived on the weekly mail wagon. The familiar handwriting belonged to her former employer in Boston, offering her old position back with increased wages and accommodations. The unexpected lifeline to her past life arrived like a ghost, haunting her with what-ifs and might-have-beens. She sat alone at the kitchen table, the Wyoming morning light streaming through windows that no longer felt quite as foreign as they once had. 3 months had passed since she'd stepped off that dusty stagecoach, yet sometimes she still felt like an intruder in the Rourke household, especially after Elias's visit had stirred up so much tension. "Miss Clara, can you help me with my hair?" Lottie appeared in the doorway, clutching her rag doll and a hairbrush. The child's hopeful expression made Clara quickly fold the letter and tuck it into her pocket. "Of course, sweetheart," she replied, pushing thoughts of Boston aside as she braided the girl's hair, marveling at how these small rituals had become precious to her. Later that afternoon, Clara found herself in the barn, the place that had witnessed her lowest moments and most honest prayers. She pulled out the letter again, tracing the words with her fingertip. Return to civilization, regular hours, proper society, everything she'd once valued. Bad news? Caleb's voice startled her. The rancher stood in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the setting sun. An opportunity? Clara answered carefully. My old position in Boston is available. Something flickered across his face, concern, perhaps even fear, before his expression returned to its usual stoic mask. I see. I haven't decided anything, she added hastily. Caleb nodded, then surprised her by sitting beside her on the hay bale. Wyoming's not Boston. Never will be. I know that, but it has its own kind of beauty. His voice softened. Its own kind of belonging. Clara looked down at her hands, once soft and unblemished, now calloused and capable. She thought of Lottie's morning hugs, the ranch hand's respectful nods, even Miss Abigail's friendship in town. The letter suddenly felt lighter in her hands, less consequential. I came here seeking something I'd lost, she admitted. I never expected to find something new instead. Outside, the first snow began to fall, delicate flakes drifting past the barn window. The decision that had seemed so weighty that morning now settled in her heart with unexpected clarity. Boston belonged to her past. Here, amidst the hardship and beauty of Wyoming, something new was taking root, something worth staying for. Clara Whitfield pulled the wagon to a halt outside the general store, her hands raw from the leather reins. 4 months at the Rourke Ranch had toughened her once delicate Boston fingers, but some days the work still left its mark. She checked her list of supplies: flour, coffee, ammunition, and a small bag of peppermint candies for Lottie. As she stepped into the store, the shopkeeper barely acknowledged her presence. Clara had grown accustomed to such treatment, focusing instead on gathering what they needed. Through the thin wall separating the store from the saloon next door, male voices carried clearly. I give her till winter's end, a gruff voice declared. That city girl won't last when the real Wyoming cold hits. Nah, another countered. She'll run back east before the first snow. Women like her ain't cut out for ranch life. Clara froze, the sack of flour heavy in her arms. Her cheeks burned as she realized they were wagering on her failure, on her marriage to Caleb. $5 says Christmas, someone added. Rourke'll be looking for wife number 3 by spring. The laughter that followed cut deeper than any winter wind. Clara paid quickly, avoiding the shopkeeper's pitying glance, and stepped outside, fighting back tears that threatened to spill. Don't let those jackals get to you, a woman's voice called. Miss Abigail stood in the doorway of her saloon, wiping glasses with a cloth. Come have some tea. Inside the back room of the establishment, away from prying eyes, the saloon keeper poured 2 steaming cups. I heard every word, she said. Been hearing the same about myself for 15 years. How do you bear it? Clara asked, wrapping cold fingers around the warm cup. Miss Abigail smiled wryly. By outlasting every bet they ever placed against me. This town's been waiting for me to fail since the day I bought this place. She leaned forward. Men like them can't stand seeing a woman make her own way. But I haven't made my way, Clara whispered. I'm still struggling with everything. You're still here, the older woman countered. That's more than most would manage. Clara straightened her shoulders. They're betting I won't last till spring. Then give them the worst losing bet of their lives, Miss Abigail said with a wink. Nothing silences gossip like proving it wrong. As Clara drove the wagon back toward the ranch, determination replaced her hurt. The endless Wyoming horizon stretched before her, and somewhere in that vastness was the place she now fought to call home. Let them wager. She would show them all what a Boston woman could endure. The storm came without warning, rolling across the prairie with a fury that sent cattle scattering and horses bucking in their stalls. Caleb Rourke had insisted on securing the north pasture fence himself, despite Clara's protests about the darkening sky. His stubbornness, the very quality that had kept the ranch alive through drought and hardship, proved his undoing when lightning split the air above him. His mare spooked, rearing violently as thunder crashed overhead. The rancher, usually so steady in the saddle, was thrown hard against the rocky ground. 2 ranch hands found him unconscious, rain pelting his still form, and carried him back to the house on a makeshift stretcher. 3 broken ribs and that leg won't hold weight for weeks, Doc Wilson muttered after his examination, packing away his instruments with grim efficiency. Keep him still, or he'll puncture a lung." Clara nodded, her face composed even as panic fluttered in her chest. Winter approached rapidly, and a ranch couldn't run itself. She watched Lottie curl beside her father's bed, small fingers clutching his calloused hand. "Papa will get better, won't he?" the child whispered that night as Clara tucked her into bed. "Your father is strong," she answered, smoothing Lottie's hair, "and we must be strong for him now." Morning brought frost and responsibility. Clara rose before dawn, her Boston upbringing nowhere evident as she pulled on work clothes and marched to the barn. The ranch hands shuffled nervously when she appeared, doubt clear in their weathered faces. "Mr. Jenkins," she addressed the foreman directly, "we need to finish the north fence today and move the cattle to the sheltered pasture before the next storm." "With all due respect, ma'am," he replied, hat in hand, "those are decisions Mr. Rourke makes." Clara straightened her spine. "And now I'm making them, unless you'd prefer to explain to my husband why we lost half the herd to exposure." By midday, she had organized repair teams, feed schedules, and prioritized the urgent winterizing of the barn. Her hands blistered as she worked alongside the men, her determination earning reluctant nods of approval. Each evening, Clara returned to the ranch house exhausted but resolute, tending to Caleb's wounds and reading to Lottie by lamplight. The rancher watched her with new eyes as she efficiently managed household accounts and discussed cattle prices. "You're full of surprises," he said one night, his voice rough with pain and something else. "Respect." "Necessity teaches quickly," she replied, changing his bandages with gentle hands. As days turned to weeks, Clara's confidence grew. She negotiated with suppliers, organized the winter stores, and even helped deliver a foal during a midnight snowstorm. The ranch hands began coming to her with questions, seeking her approval on decisions large and small. When Caleb finally managed to sit up in bed, he found not the uncertain mail-order bride who had arrived months ago, but a woman who had earned her place on the land. And in his heart, the blizzard shrieked like a wounded animal, piling snow against the Rourke ranch house until the windows were half buried in white. Clara Whitfield huddled near the fireplace, feeding it the last decent-sized log from their dwindling supply. Outside, the temperature had plummeted so low that even the wolves' howls seemed to freeze in midair. "Will we have enough to eat tomorrow?" Lottie whispered, her small frame pressed against Clara's side for warmth. "We always find a way," Clara answered, though her stomach had been growling for days. Their stores of preserved meat and vegetables were nearly gone, and hunting had become impossible in the treacherous drifts. In the corner, Caleb sat with a blanket draped over his shoulders, still recovering from his fall. His face was drawn with worry as he watched the fire's reflection dance across his daughter's hopeful eyes. The rancher had never faced a winter this brutal, and never with someone else's welfare weighing so heavily on his conscience. "I should be out there," he muttered, frustration evident in every syllable. "The cattle." "The hands are checking on them," Clara interrupted gently. "You'll do no one any good by reopening your wounds." Their eyes met across the room, and something unspoken passed between them. Since his injury, the dynamics of their arrangement had shifted. The former Bostonian now managed household rationing, directed the remaining ranch hands, and kept spirits from plummeting as low as the mercury. That night, when Lottie's shivers prevented her from sleeping, Clara gathered them all close to the hearth and began to tell stories of spring in Massachusetts, of apple blossoms and sailing ships returning to harbor. Her voice, clear and steady, painted pictures of warmth and abundance that made even Caleb lean forward to listen. "Sing the boat song again," Lottie requested, her eyes heavy with approaching sleep. Clara obliged, her melody rising above the wind's mournful keening. The child drifted off with a smile on her lips, and Caleb found himself watching the firelight play across Clara's face. "You're good with her," he admitted quietly. "Better than I expected." "She makes it easy to be good," Clara replied. The next morning brought no relief from the cold, but something had changed in the atmosphere of the house. Caleb allowed Clara to help him to the table without his usual protests. When she managed to create a surprisingly tasty stew from nearly nothing, his appreciative nod felt like a victory. As days passed and supplies grew scarcer, they developed new routines. Clara read aloud from the few books in the house. Caleb taught Lottie to whittle small animals from scraps of wood. They huddled together during the worst nights, the boundaries between mail-order bride and reluctant husband blurring with each shared hardship. Lottie's laughter, once as rare as sunshine in this endless winter, began to bubble up more frequently, a sound as precious as any resource they were conserving. In the heart of deprivation, they found an unexpected abundance, the warmth of becoming a true family. The railroad men arrived at the Rourke ranch on a crisp morning. their polished boots and clean-shaven faces stark contrasts to the weathered cowboys. Clara Whitfield watched from the porch as Caleb's shoulders stiffened at the sight of their approach. These were the same men who had threatened their way of life months before, yet now they carried maps instead of threats. "We're proposing a depot right here," the lead negotiator explained, spreading blueprints across the kitchen table. "Your land becomes a gateway to the east. Supplies, travelers, new markets for your cattle, all within reach." Caleb ran his calloused fingers over the drawings, his expression unreadable. "And what happens to the ranchers who can't adapt?" he asked, voice low. "Progress waits for no one, Mr. Rourke," the man replied simply. That night, after Lottie had been tucked in, Clara found her husband staring out at the darkened prairie. The moonlight cast long shadows across his troubled face. "My father built this ranch with nothing but determination and raw hands," he said without turning. "Elias wants me to sell. These railroad men want to transform everything. Sometimes I wonder if I'm fighting the inevitable." Clara stood beside him, their shoulders barely touching. "In Boston, I watched neighborhoods change, overnight. Some fought it and lost everything. Others embraced it and thrived." "And which would you choose?" Caleb asked, finally meeting her eyes. "I'm thinking of Lottie," she answered honestly. "A depot means a school might follow. Doctors. More children her age." His jaw tightened. "And what of our way of life?" "The ranch can still be the ranch," Clara said, taking his rough hand in hers, "but with new possibilities. Your father built this place to survive. Perhaps you are meant to help it thrive." For 3 days, Caleb rode the boundaries of his land alone, wrestling with the decision. The ranch hands exchanged worried glances as he disappeared at dawn and returned at dusk, silent and brooding. On the 4th morning, Clara found him in the barn, holding his father's old saddle. "He would have hated this," Caleb admitted, "but he never had a daughter to consider." "What have you decided?" she asked quietly. "I'm going to negotiate terms that protect what matters most," he said. "The heart of the ranch stays ours, but we'll welcome the depot, for Lottie's future, for our future." Clara nodded, understanding the magnitude of his choice. It wasn't surrender, it was adaptation, the very quality that had allowed them all to survive the harsh Wyoming winters. "We'll face it together," she promised, the weight of the decision settling between them like a pact. The town hall buzzed with conversation as families gathered for the spring social. Clara Whitfield stood near the refreshment table, still feeling the weight of curious glances despite the months she'd spent in Wyoming territory. The railroad negotiations had brought everyone together, tension mingling with excitement as the community faced inevitable change. "Miss Clara," Mrs. Peterson approached with a forced smile. "How are you managing at the Rourke place?" "Still adjusting to ranch life, I imagine." Clara recognized the familiar undercurrent of judgment before she could respond. Little Lottie darted through the crowd, her once shy demeanor replaced by confident steps. The child's dress, carefully mended by Clara's hands, swirled around her ankles as she rushed forward. "Mama! Look what I found!" Lottie exclaimed, holding up a wildflower bouquet, her voice ringing clear through the suddenly hushed room. The word hung in the air like a bell's echo. "Mama." Not Miss Clara or Miss Whitfield, but Mama, spoken without hesitation, without question. What had begun as a tearful inquiry in the barn's shadows had transformed into a declaration of belonging. Mrs. Peterson's eyes widened, and whispers rippled through the gathering. Clara knelt down, her throat tight with emotion, and accepted the flowers with trembling hands. "They're beautiful, sweetheart," she managed, tucking a strand of hair behind Lottie's ear. Across the room, Caleb stood frozen, his weathered face reflecting a complex storm of emotions. The rancher had maintained his careful distance even as they'd worked, side by side through winter's trials. But now, watching his daughter's unguarded affection, something shifted in his expression. He moved through the crowd with purpose, coming to stand beside them. His hand, calloused from years of ranch work, found Clara's shoulder in a gesture that spoke volumes to the onlookers. "Looks like our girl picked the prettiest flowers for you," he said, his voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear the possessive "our." Miss Abigail approached, her saloon-keeper's apron exchanged for Sunday best. "Well," she said with a knowing smile, "seems the Rourke family is finally complete." The whispers changed tone, transforming from speculation to acceptance. Clara felt the shift like a physical wave, the public claiming of what had been growing privately for months. That evening, as they rode home in the wagon, Lottie fell asleep between them, her head resting trustingly against Clara's side. Caleb drove in silence for miles before finally speaking. "She's been waiting to call you that for a long time," he said softly. "Reckon I've been waiting too." Under the vast Wyoming sky, Clara finally felt the last walls around her heart crumble. She was home. The wind howled like a wounded beast as the worst blizzard in 20 years descended upon the Wyoming territory. Snow piled against the Rourke ranch house in drifts taller than a man, sealing doors and windows as if nature itself had decided to bury them alive. "We need to move the remaining cattle to the south pasture," Caleb said, his voice barely audible above the storm's fury. Clara nodded, already pulling on her third layer of clothing. The rancher had learned not to question her determination anymore. "Lottie stays with me," Clara insisted, wrapping the child in every blanket they could spare. "The barn will be warmer than the house now." For 5 days they fought against starvation and freezing temperatures. Their food stores dwindled to nearly nothing. A handful of beans, some dried meat, the last precious cup of flour. When Clara caught Caleb secretly giving his portion to Lottie, she confronted him in the flickering light of their dwindling fire. "You'll die if you keep this up," she whispered fiercely, her breath visible in the frigid air. "Better me than her," he answered simply. "Better none of us," Clara countered, taking his rough hands in hers. "We survive together, or not at all." In those desperate hours, the last walls between them crumbled. Huddled together for warmth, they spoke of things long buried: his wife's death during childbirth, Clara's broken engagement that had sent her fleeing west, their shared fears of inadequacy and failure. "I was afraid to love again," Caleb admitted one night, his voice thick with emotion. "Thought it would dishonor her memory." Clara leaned against his shoulder. "And I was terrified you'd never see me as anything but a convenient mother for Lottie." The rancher turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the last embers of their fire. "I see you, Clara. I've seen you since that day in the barn with Lottie. I was just too stubborn to admit it." On the 6th day, when they had nearly lost hope, the storm broke. Together they dug pathways through snow taller than Lottie, checking on surviving livestock and assessing the damage. 3 cattle had been lost, but the core of their herd had survived. That evening, as they gathered in the barn where their journey had begun, Lottie's laughter echoed against the weathered beams as she chased a kitten born during the storm. Clara caught Caleb watching her with unguarded tenderness. "We made it," she said simply. He nodded, taking her hand in his calloused one. "Not by convenience." "No," Clara agreed. "By choice." The barn, once a sanctuary for her lonely tears, now held the warmth of something far more precious than she had ever dared to hope for. A family forged in sacrifice, stronger than any storm. The Wyoming prairie burst into life as winter surrendered its grip, painting the landscape with wildflowers and tender green shoots. Clara Whitfield Rourke stood on the porch of the ranch house, her fingers intertwined with Caleb's calloused hand. The morning sun caught in his sagebrush eyes as he gazed at the horizon where the new railroad depot stood, its wooden frame a testament to compromise and foresight. "Huh, never thought I'd welcome those tracks," he murmured, squeezing her hand. "Funny how things change." Lottie dashed across the yard, her laughter carried on the spring breeze. "Mama! Papa! Miss Abigail's wagon is coming." The word "Mama" still warmed Clara's heart each time it fell from the child's lips, no longer a question but a certainty. The saloon keeper had become a regular visitor, bringing news from town and friendship that had sustained Clara through the darkest days. Today, she wasn't alone. Several families followed behind her vehicle, bringing dishes and conversation for the barn gathering Clara had organized to celebrate the ranch's survival and renewal. "They actually came," Clara whispered, remembering the sting of those early whispers and sideways glances in town. Caleb nodded. "Because of you. This place was just land and cattle before. You made it a home." The barn, once Clara's sanctuary for solitary tears, now echoed with music and conversation. Ranch hands who had once eyed the Boston bride with skepticism now tipped their hats respectfully. The community that had wagered on her failure now sought her advice on everything from preserving vegetables to negotiating with the railroad men. Even Elias had returned, standing awkwardly at the edge of the celebration until Caleb crossed the room and handed him a drink. The brothers' reconciliation remained tentative, but the shared blood and memories proved stronger than their differences. As twilight painted the sky in violet and gold, Clara slipped away to the quiet corner of the barn where she had first heard Lottie's innocent question. The space had transformed from a place of isolation to the heart of their community. Running her fingers along the weathered wood, she marveled at how a life constructed from necessity had blossomed into one chosen with love. "Found you," Caleb said, stepping into the shadows. Lottie trailed behind him, clutching her beloved rag doll. "Just remembering," Clara replied. "The crying?" Lottie asked with childish directness. "And everything after," Clara answered, drawing the girl close. "Everything that made us family." Caleb wrapped his arms around them both, his embrace steady as the land beneath their feet. Outside, the Wyoming wind swept across the plains they now called home, carrying the promise of seasons yet to come.